Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Walter Kane, and 5 years ago, I built a small cabin on a lake island because I needed a place that stayed quiet even when life got loud. The divorce papers were signed. The town felt suffocating, and weekends had turned into a blur of errands and forced small talk that didn't fix anything. Out there, it was simple mechanics. One room, a cast iron wood stove, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bunk built into the wall. Most summers, I left it alone to the bugs and the heat. But every fall, when the air sharpened and the fishing got serious, I came back with a tackle box and a desperate need for a few days of silence. Early winter hits this region like a hammer. 1 week you're in a light fleece, the next you're scraping heavy frost off the windshield, hauling extra wool blankets, and watching the first skim of ice choke the sheltered cows. That was the weather setting in when everything else started to break apart. It happened on a standard Friday night with me at my house 2 hours from the lake watching a game I didn't care about just to have noise in the room. The phone buzzed, then buzzed again, and the alerts stopped sounding like weather warnings. The headlines were blunt and impossible to process. Riots in major hubs, coordinated attacks, a contagion spreading faster than news could track, and official instructions that didn't match the terrifying videos leaking online. Sirens ramped up outside, wailing past the house, then stayed in the air like a warning you couldn't tune out. A neighbor knocked hard on the frame and called, "Walter, you seeing this?" The chain stayed on the door and I spoke through the gap. "Yeah," I said, "I'm seeing enough." He hesitated, his shadow shifting on the porch, and added, "They're telling people to go to shelters at the high school. Stay home if you can." I answered and heard him move off my porch with heavy, unsure steps. No plan felt safe, but one idea held its ground. If the roads turned into traps and the town turned into a panic, the island gave me distance, deep cold water and time. The only question was whether I could reach the launch before the lake became everyone else's escape route. 2. Friday nights in this zip code used to be dead quiet. That night, the house sounded thin, like the insulation had vanished, and every noise outside had more room to travel. Cars sped past in aggressive bursts, tires whining on asphalt, and sirens kept rising and falling from 3 different directions. Local radio was the first check. One station played dead air, just a low static hum. Another looped a calm, pre-recorded message about isolated civil incidents and staying indoors. But the voice sounded strained and the signal kept dipping into fuzz. Phone service still worked, but barely. Short clips loaded from downtown feeds. People running in a stampede. Someone motionless on the pavement. A cluster of bystanders bending over him and then scrambling back in sudden terror. Another clip showed a hospital entrance with chained doors and staff and scrubs yelling at a crowd to step back. That wasn't a normal riot. It was fear with no rules attached. A text came through from my ex. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm fine," I answered and added, "Stay inside and lock up. Don't open for anyone." She replied with a thumbs up emoji, and that was it. The cabin on the island was basic. 5 years ago, it was just a renovation project and a place to cast a line. No power grid, no comfort beyond what I carried in on my back. Tools and spare lumber were already out there in a locked job box, but the first move had to be fast. I needed food, water, warmth, light, and a way to leave again. The kitchen turned into a staging ground. I didn't cherry pick. I swept the shelves. Cans went first. Beans, soup, tuna, chili, then boxes of rice and pasta. Then the density foods like peanut butter, coffee, and salt. 2 full 5-gallon water jugs came out of the garage. And I grabbed a case of extra bottles because clean water is never the thing you regret carrying too much of. Cold gear went on top of the food crates. Heavy wool socks, work gloves, a knit cap, thermal base layers, and insulated bibs. The lake acts like a massive heat sink, even when the air feels mild. And early winter doesn't give second chances if you get soaked. For light and information, a headlamp, spare lithium batteries, and a hand-crank emergency radio went into the duffel along with a brick of matches and a lighter. A small solar battery pack for charging came too. None of it was fancy survivalist gear. It was just hardware that worked without asking permission from a wall outlet. Defense was a hard box to open, but it had to be opened. A bolt-action hunting rifle with a simple 3-to-N timescope came out of the safe, plus 3 boxes of hunting rounds. It wasn't a movie sniper setup. It was a tool that could reach across open water if people tried to close the distance. A pump shotgun followed for the close end of the problem, and a small handgun went in a side pouch. Everything stayed unloaded until it was packed, and the rules stayed simple. Chamber empty, muzzle in a safe direction. Extra hardware went into the truck bed. A heavy towing chain to harden padlocks, a box of 3-inch screws, a pry bar, and a roll of thick 6mm plastic sheeting. Those were for slowing people down, sealing drafts, and making one door act like 2 doors. Outside, porch lights were popping on up and down the street. A neighbor stood in his driveway gripping a baseball bat, looking more lost than tough, and he called out asking if I was leaving. "Going to the lake," I said, tossing the last bag in. He shook his head, staring at his phone, and said, "They're opening shelters at the high school." "Shelters are crowds," I answered, "and crowds are going to be the problem." He didn't argue. He just turned away to take a call that probably wouldn't connect. The boat was the hinge in my plan. It was tied at the public marina with other people's pleasure craft. Same as always. The difference was the ignition key, and that stayed on my key ring. If someone untied it, they could drift it or tow it. But running it was harder without the key. That habit was the only reason I believed the hull might still be there when I arrived. Before leaving, the house got shut down, curtains closed, lights killed. A note on the counter with my ex's number. Not sentimental, just practical logic. A new emergency alert hit as the front deadbolt clicked. Curfew in effect. Avoid contact with anyone acting confused or aggressive. Do not attempt to render aid unless directed. That last line was the one that mattered. The system was already telling people to look away to survive. The truck rolled onto the main road and brake lights were already stacking up near the highway entrance ramp. A cruiser blocked the far lane and drivers were pulling U-turns over the median. A woman leaned out of her window and yelled, "They're closing the ramps. State police are shutting it down." Back roads were the answer. The route to the lake had old county blacktops that didn't feed straight into the city. Fuel was the next issue because empty tanks turned strangers into threats. The nearest station was already sliding into chaos. Only 2 pumps worked. Cars waited 3 deep with engines idling and fumes hanging in the cold air. Inside, someone shouted at the clerk about credit card readers. I put cash down, filled the tank, and topped off to red jerry cans. A man behind me stared at the cans, his eyes darting, and asked if I had extra to sell. "No," I answered, stepping between him and the nozzle. "I'm running on fumes myself." I capped the cans and kept moving. The drive out of town felt different than any other trip. A sedan sat on the shoulder with its door open and nobody around. Farther down, something moved near a ditch line, stiff and sure, like it didn't care about the temperature. Headlights caught a pale face for a second. Blood smeared dark around the mouth, and then it turned toward the trees with a jerky mechanical motion. Speed stayed steady. Doors stayed locked. The lake was still a long way off, and the night had only started for me. The county road to the lake runs through a patchwork of failing farms and scrub pine. And that night it felt like a corridor between 2 different worlds. The glow of the township was fading behind me. Most houses were dark, and the few with lights burning looked like the residents had decided to stay awake with shotguns in their laps. A choke point formed near the small municipality by the public launch. Cars clogged the 4-way stop. Horns blared in frustration. People leaned out of windows to scream arguments. And one Ford pickup sat half across a lane, door hanging open, abandoned like the driver had simply changed their mind and walked into the woods. A man in a flannel jacket stepped into the middle of the road and waved his arms to flag me down. I kept the window up and the truck moving slow but steady as he shouted, "Where are you headed?" When he saw the loaded bed, he jogged alongside the fender and yelled, "You're loaded heavy. They're saying to go to the shelters." I kept my eyes forward and called back through the glass, "Go home and lock your door right now." He slapped the rear quarter panel in frustration and fell behind as I pushed through the gap. Past town, the last mile dropped into a hollow between bare trees and limestone cuts. Headlights caught something crouched near the drainage ditch, a figure that turned its head in quick spasmodic jerks and stayed low to the ground. Speed stayed steady and I kept the truck centered on the yellow line. The dock lot came into view and it was way too full for early winter. Engines idled. High beams swept the gravel and families were hauling duffels like they were moving out in a single trip. My boat was where it should be, tied in with the rest. Third slip from the end. It was a plain aluminum hull with a 25-horse outboard. Nothing special unless you needed it to disappear. 2 slips down, a guy was untying a pontoon boat with shaking hands, fumbling the knots, and farther along the dock, a couple was screaming at each other over a missing fuel can. A woman standing near the ramp looked straight at me, eyes wide, and asked, "Is it true the highway is barricaded?" "I don't know," I answered, not stopping. She stepped closer and asked, "You think the lake is safe?" "Safer than a packed gym," I said, and kept walking toward the slip. The outboard key was already in my pocket. Rope off, quick check of the fuel line, quick squeeze of the primer bulb until it went hard. Everything looked normal, but normal was already evaporating. Rick from the bait shop was there, hunched over his cooler like he was guarding gold. He pulled his flashlight out and said, "Walter, you punching out?" "Yeah," I said. "You too." He nodded once, nervous, and added, "My brother called from the city. He says people are actually biting, and the cops can't hold the lines." His eyes flicked to my truck bed, and he asked, "You going to your place?" "Somewhere quiet," I answered. A scream snapped from the upper lot, short and sharp, and every head on the dock turned at once. A man stumbled out from between 2 parked trucks, hit the gravel face first, popped back up with impossible speed, and moved straight at the nearest person with his mouth open. The guy nearest to him lifted his hands in a calm-down gesture and said, "Hey, buddy, you okay?" The question didn't even register. The attacker lunged, grabbed the guy by the collar of his jacket, and bit down hard at the neckline. And tearing meat. People yelled at once, not in clean terms, just raw, panic noise. Someone shouted for help. Someone else yelled that he was on drugs, and another voice screamed for a gun. The crowd split instantly between people who froze and people who bolted. A woman tried to drag the victim back by his belt, and the attacker snapped his head around, caught her forearm, and she yanked away with blood already bright on her sleeve. The victim fell and crawled, and nobody moved fast enough to stop it clean. The shotgun was in the truck, but there was no safe shot on a dock full of panic bodies and bouncing flashlights. Distance was the only smart move left. Loading turned into muscle memory while the chaos distracted the crowd. Duffel first, then the heavy food crates, then water, then fuel. The rifle case slid under the bench seat where it wouldn't flash in the headlights. Truck keys went into my pocket and the tailgate got shut with one quiet push. Rick stared at the blood on the gravel and whispered, "This is bad. This is real bad." He grabbed his cooler, hesitated, and added, "You need help." "No," I said, stepping into the boat. "Get off the dock, Rick. Don't try to be a hero tonight." He nodded once, terrified, and backed away toward his truck. The outboard started on the second pull. A loud cough that drew eyes, but I was already shifting gears. The bow eased out of the slip and the dock light slid away as the boat picked up speed. Behind me, the dock was a mess of shouting and running figures, and I didn't look back again until the lights were just small stars against the trees. The lake opened into black water with a light chop, and shoreline houses looked like scattered squares of yellow safety. Halfway out, the wind hit harder and the air turned sharp on my face and the noise from shore thinned to almost nothing. The island sat ahead as a low hump of trees on rock. From a distance, it looked like nothing worth visiting. And that was the point. The cabin was tucked back from the edge with no light and no sign of life. Throttle came down as I closed in, not for the dead, but for the living. A fast boat makes a wake and a story across water, but a slow boat can disappear into shadow. The landing spot was slick with the first dusting of snow. The hull kissed stone, the engine got cut, and silence came back fast, heavy and absolute. Rope went around the same thick route I always used, and the duffel came up first, then the food and water, then the tools. One last look across the lake showed no running lights following me. But that didn't mean nobody was out there. It only meant nobody wanted to be seen. The cabin waded up the short rise between the pines. The padlock was still on the hasp. The door was still shut. That was good news, and it also meant the real work started now. The padlock clicked open, and the snap of metal felt aggressively loud in the quiet trees. The door swung inward and cold air spilled out to meet me. A mix of stale pine, cast iron from the stove, and undisturbed dust. 5 years of weekend trips had trained me to move through this space with muscle memory. But this wasn't a weekend fishing trip, and the usual sense of ownership wasn't there. The first step was confirming that nobody else had claimed the spot. The floorboards near the entry were still gritty with the sand I tracked in last October, and the layer of dust on the table sat unbroken. No fresh scuffs on the floor, no candy wrappers in the corners, no new axe cuts in the wood pile outside. It didn't guarantee safety. Someone could have been and gone. But it meant I wasn't walking blindly into an occupied camp. The boat was my lifeline, so hiding it was priority one. If the hull stayed visible at the landing, anyone scanning with binoculars from the mainland could connect the dots. I hauled the aluminum hull higher onto the rock shelf until the waves couldn't tap against it. Then threw a heavy canvas tarp over the top and lashed it down. To break up the unnatural straight lines of the tarp, I dragged loose pine boughs and deadfall over it. From open water, it just looked like a dark, shapeless lump under the treein. Inside, light discipline was the next rule. The lantern stayed cold. My headlamp went to its lowest red light setting and stayed pointed at my boots. The heavy wooden shutters I'd built years ago got swung closed and latched tight so no firelight would flicker out across the water. Heat wasn't a luxury, it was survival. The stove was small, but it had always punched above its weight if it was fed right. I used dry newspaper from a plastic tote and a fistful of bone-dry kindling, then added 2 seasoned split logs. 1 match, a steady flame, and the stove door clicked shut. Warmth came slow, then stronger, and the metal roof ticked as the iron expanded. Gear got staged where it belonged, not dumped in a pile. Water jugs went by the door for quick grabs. The food crate slid under the table. Batteries and the radio went to the high shelf. The rifle case stayed closed, but sat within arm's reach because fumbling for a weapon in the dark is how accidents happen. A small first aid kit went on the tablis where cold hands could find it without thinking. The cabin had 3 weak points, the door and the 2 windows facing the lake. Years ago, they were for the view and the breeze. Tonight, they were tactical liabilities. Spare boards from an old deck project were stacked behind the stove. I pulled out a cordless drill and a box of long deck screws. The first board went across the lower half of the nearest window, then a second above it, leaving only a narrow horizontal slit at eye level. It was enough to scan the dock line and the tree edge, but not enough for someone to reach an arm through. Drafts showed themselves once the fire began to pull air. Cold currents slid under the sill and around the frame, so I stapled thick plastic sheeting along the seams and hung a heavy moving blanket over the whole setup, securing it with washers. Nothing touched the stove side. Fire safety still mattered more than comfort. A sanitation corner went together near the back wall, just a 5-gallon bucket with a tight lid, a stack of heavy-duty trash bags, a bar of soap, and a bottle of sanitizer. Getting sick out here with dysentery or flu would be stupid, and dirty hands kill you faster than bullets in conditions like this. The other window got the same boarded treatment, and I feathered the trigger on the drill, driving the screws in slow burst to keep the high-pitched whine from traveling over the water. No banging, no yelling, no test shots into the trees. Sound carries on water like it's sliding on glass, and I wanted the island to stay boring. The door had a deadbolt, but I didn't trust a $20 lock. Two heavy steel brackets were screwed into the studs on either side of the frame, and a thick 4x4 post slid into place as a drop bar. Standing back, the entry finally looked like something that would hold long enough for me to wake up and react. Outside, the wind moved through the pine needles, and the lake pushed small rhythmic waves against the rock. No voices carried, no engines hummed in the distance. That quiet should have felt calming, but it didn't. It felt like the heavy, pressurized moment after a storm passes when you're waiting to see what actually broke. Boots went near the stove to warm and dry while layers replaced anything damp from the boat ride. A mug of hot water and instant coffee warmed my hands and kept my head steady. Before lying down, I gave the shoreline one more scan through the viewing slit. The dock lights on the mainland were gone. The town glow was still there, faint and orange against the clouds, but smaller than it should have been. Somewhere far off, a siren rose, wailed for a minute, and faded into silence. The sleeping bag went on the bunk with an extra wool blanket over it, and the rifle sat propped against the wall. The last thing I did was set a poor man's alarm by the door. A length of fishing line tied low to the latch with 2 empty soup cans suspended on it. If the door moved an inch, the cans would rattle against the wood. It was crude, but it worked without batteries. Sleep didn't come fast. The stove popped once, then settled into a hiss. Wind hit the roof, then passed. Every time the lake slapped the stone, it sounded like a footstep. At some point, the body gives up and shuts down. Anyway, one thought stayed clear. The island was quiet now, and I needed to keep it that way. Morning broke with a flat gray sky and a thin, brittle crust of frost on the porch steps. The cast iron stove had held its heat through the night, but the cabin still felt like a wooden box that could be cracked open if someone tried hard enough. So the real work started before breakfast. The first job was the windows. The initial boards across the glass were just a start, not a finish. A desperate person with a pry bar can peel a single plank in seconds. So the goal wasn't to build a bank vault. It was to make every attempt at entry slow, loud, and exhausting. 2 more layers of pressure-treated lumber went across each window, offset so the screw holes didn't line up. I sandwiched a layer of cardboard between the wood and the glass to dampen vibration, then stapled a second layer of thick plastic sheeting under the moving blankets. The viewing slit stayed narrow, about 3 in high because seeing the lake mattered more than sleeping in total darkness. Next came the door. The 4x4 drop bar was solid, but the frame was old pine and dry pine splits when you kick it hard. I found a strip of galvanized scrap metal from an old dock bracket and screwed it along the latch side of the jamb, then added another strip near the hinges. It was ugly, industrial, and jagged, but it reinforced the wood against splitting. A wooden wedge sat on the floor behind the drop bar so it couldn't bounce out of place during a battering, and I tied a second wedge to the wall with paracord so it wouldn't vanish in the chaos of a rush. Outside, the landing needed to stop looking like an invitation. The path up to the cabin was a natural fatal funnel, a straight line through the brush, and straight lines invite feet. I dragged heavy deadfall and tangled branches across the trail, then 2 fresh pine boughs over the top to break the silhouette. Nature doesn't draw straight lines, so I made sure the blockage looked like random storm damage. I moved a few jagged rocks to make the last 10 yards awkward footing, ensuring anyone climbing in the dark would have to slow down or risk a twisted ankle. The boat was still the biggest giveaway. Even covered pulling it up had left a clean, bright scrape on the lichen-covered rock. I scattered sand and wet leaf litter over the marks until the stone looked undisturbed. The fuel cans went into a shallow hole dug behind a stump covered with a flat stone and a layer of pine needles. If someone ever raided the camp and found the boat, the tank would be light, and that lack of fuel would buy me time. A second perimeter alarm went in near the shoreline. Braided fishing line ran between 2 low branches knee-high on the most natural approach with 3 small brass bells from an old tip-up rig clipped to it. Anyone stepping through would hear the chime, and if they saw the line and tried to crawl under, they would be slow and vulnerable. Inside, the cabin got organized like a ship at sea. Supplies in one big pile creates a mess, and a mess wastes seconds you don't have. Food went into two distinct crates, one for heavy cans, one for dry goods like rice and oats. I taped a piece of cardboard inside the lid of each crate with a pencil tied to it. An active inventory list. If you don't count your calories, you eat them too fast. Water jugs stayed in the coolest corner to keep the plastic stable. Medical gear went into a dedicated waterproof tote marked with red tape. A corner by the back wall turned into the hygiene zone. The sanitation bucket with the tight lid stayed there, trash bags stacked beside it, and a hand-washing station sat on a crate. Just a jug with a spigot, a bar of soap, and sanitizer. It wasn't pretty, but it kept fecal bacteria off the food. And out here, dysentery kills you just as dead as a gunshot. The stove became its own science. Wood got stacked inside in a neat row, kindling in a separate box, and the axe stayed by the door with the handle facing out for a quick grab. Wet wood makes white smoke, and smoke is a signal flare. The dry pile outside got a better cover. A tarp angled steeply so snow would slide off with heavy bricks anchoring the corners against the wind. Staying hidden meant strict habits. Light discipline was absolute. At night, the headlamp used a red filter made from tail light tape, and the beam stayed on the floor. The lantern only breathed when the shutters were blackout tight. No raised voices because sound skips across cold water like a stone. Smoke was the traitor. The solution was physics. Smaller fires fed more often with the damper adjusted to burn hot and clean rather than smoldering. During the day, if the air was still and the sky was blue, the stove stayed cold because smoke would rise in a perfect visible column. I only burned when the wind was strong enough to disperse the exhaust, or at night when the dark hit the plume. From my hill, most houses on the far shore looked dark. But one yard fire burned bright, and the people around it moved in open loud circles like they expected the night to forgive them. The rifle came out for a real setup. I built a stable shooting rest on the table using 2 blocks of wood and a folded blanket so the barrel could sit without a tremor. I couldn't test fire to zero the scope without giving away my position. So I bore-sighted it, visually checking the alignment against the iron sights. I made a range card for the shoreline, measuring the distance to known markers. The broken dock, 200 yards. The boathouse roof, 150 yards. The tall pine near the road cut, 280 yard. If a boat came in, I wouldn't be guessing the drop. I'd know it. Food rules started that same morning. 2 meals a day, not 3, and absolutely no eating to calm the nerves. Coffee got rationed to 1 spoonful and the sugar stayed sealed. When hands reached for a can, the label got read twice, so nothing premium got burned early by accident. By late afternoon, the cabin looked rougher, uglier, but much stronger. Boards covered the windows, brush choked the approach, and the alarm sat silent and waiting. The island still felt exposed. Any place does when the world is breaking, but it no longer felt soft. If anyone came by daylight, the plan was to stay silent, let them pass, and never give them a target. That night, the wind dropped and the lake went glass smooth, which meant sound carried for miles. A distant engine ran for a minute, then cut. Then another started closer and cut again. The headlamp stayed off. The viewing slit stayed open, and my hand rested near the bolt of the rifle while I waited to see what direction the trouble would choose. Heat became the only currency that really mattered. Early winter in this region loves to play gentle until the wind shifts from the north, and then it turns a wet sleeve into a hypothermia problem that can end your day in 20 minutes. The stove could carry the cabin, but only if the island carried the stove. Processing wood became the mandatory morning shift. Standing dead trees, snags were the priority because they were already seasoned and dry. Greenwood hisses and smokes, and smoke is a beacon. I used a bow saw instead of the axe for felling, because sawing is a rhythmic, low-frequency sound that doesn't travel as far as the sharp crack of an axe chopping. Limbs got trimmed, trunks got bucked into stove lengths, and everything got split smaller than normal. Small pieces catch fast, burn hot, and produce less smoke column than a smoldering log. A second would stack when inside, not for aesthetics, but because a blizzard can bury your external pile and freeze the tarp solid. A row of split oak and pine sat along the back wall, drying further in the ambient heat. The outside pile stayed under a heavy canvas tarp, pulled tight and weighted down with rocks to stop the wind from snapping the fabric. Water had to be simple because complex systems fail when the temperature drops. The lake was clean enough to support trout, but it still needed a barrier before it went into a cup. 2 5-gallon jugs got filled at the shoreline where the rock shelved down into deep water, avoiding the sediment near the edge, and then hauled up the slope. I ran the raw water through a hand-pumped ceramic filter into a clean pot, then boiled it on the stove. Not forever, just a rolling boil for 3 minutes to kill anything the filter missed without wasting fuel. When the pot cooled, it got poured into a dedicated jug marked with a strip of blue tape that read, "Drink." In low light, you don't want to guess which jug gives you parasites. I abandoned the idea of an outdoor gravity barrel. At these temperatures, the spigot would freeze and crack in a night. Instead, the running water was just a heavy jug on a shelf with a manual spout. Any overflow or gray water got tossed outside, specifically routed away from the walking path so layers of slick ice wouldn't build up where my boots needed traction. Power was never meant to be a main feature out here, but it was a force multiplier. A small lithium battery pack kept the radio alive and ensured the headlamp didn't become dead weight. The pack charged from a compact folding solar panel that I only deployed on bright, clear days and only for the short window when the sun was high. It never stayed out overnight. The goal wasn't comfort. I wasn't trying to run a fridge. The goal was information and safe light. The hand crank radio stayed as the backup. By the end of the first week, some stations were already broadcasting dead air. The weather band still worked, and that mattered more than the panic on the AM channels. When a human voice did come through, it talked about curfews, designated shelters, and military checkpoints. At one point, the announcer said, "Avoid open water if you can," and that line brought a grim, uneasy grin to my face. Food got handled like a rigid prescription, not a meal. Breakfast was hot water and a measured portion of oats. Dinner was rice with a can of beans or soup with crackers to stretch the salt. Fishing stayed on the plan, but I shifted to passive tactics. Standing on the shore with a rod makes you a silhouette. Instead, I set trot lines on the sheltered side of the island where the trees blocked the view from the mainland. Dark cord, small weights, and bait suspended just off the bottom. Checks were quick, quiet, and low profile. If a fish was hooked, it got bled and cleaned right at the waterline. The guts and head got tossed deep in down current, sinking fast so they wouldn't attract screaming seagulls. Gulls are noise, and noise attracts eyes. Hygiene needed its own dedicated zone. The bucket system worked for one person, but only if you were disciplined. Digging a pit in the frozen rocky soil wasn't an option. The toilet moved to a shallow annex I framed from scrap boards behind the cabin, shielded by a tarp. It was just a bucket with a snap-on lid lined with a heavy bag. A second bucket of wood ash sat beside it with a scoop. After use, a layer of ash went down. It cut the smell and kept the biology manageable until it could be dumped far from the camp. Inside, a second basin became the wash station. I used a minimal amount of warm water and a washcloth to stay clean. A towel stayed on a hook near the stove to dry fast. Dirty clothes turn into stink, and stink turns into a morale killer or worse, a way for predators to smell you. Wet clothes were a silent threat. Damp socks and sweaty base layers don't look dangerous, but they suck body heat all night long. A drying line went up near the ceiling where the warm air pulled, and a second line went near the stove at a safe distance. Boots stayed tipped on their sides, laces open so the moisture inside could evaporate. Fuel was treated like contraband. The gasoline cans for the boat stayed outside downwind, tucked under the stump cover. Fumes in a small sealed cabin caused headaches and bad decisions. A single isobutane canister stove sat on the shelf as a backup for emergency boiling, but 99% of the cooking stayed on the wood stove to conserve the finite gas. That maintenance took most of the daylight. Fingers stayed stiff with cold, shoulders ached from the saw, and the island stayed quiet. Late afternoon brought the faint, buzzing sound of a motor from the far water. I folded the solar panel instantly and tucked the water jugs out of sight. From the viewing slit, nothing showed on the gray lake, and the noise eventually faded south. Night brought a new problem. Ice started forming in the calm pocket near the landing. Thin, brittle sheets that whispered when the water moved. It wouldn't hold a person yet, but it meant the season was turning against me. One thought kept repeating in my head. Open water is a moat, but ice becomes a bridge. The rifle stayed close, but the real safety was the boring stuff. Keep the heat steady. Keep the water safe. Keep light and smoke invisible. A place that smells like cooking food and unburied trash is a place people notice. And a place people notice becomes a place they feel entitled to test. Food didn't feel like comfort anymore. It felt like a countdown clock that was always ticking, audible even when the cabin was warm and the lake was dead calm. The crates under the table held enough calories to get through a stretch of deep winter, but only if every meal stayed boring, and every choice remained mathematically consistent. A rigid routine helped quiet the anxiety. Hot water first thing in the morning to trick the stomach. Oats only if the hunger pangs were sharp enough to distract from work. Then a long gap of physical labor before the second meal. Cans were reserved for nights when my hands were too numb to handle prep work. Rice and pasta handled the middle days because they packed small and stretched far when you added enough water. The rationing rule wasn't spoken like a speech. It sat on the table in the form of measured plastic scoops and lids that got screwed back on tight immediately after use. Fishing stopped being a hobby and became a calorie calculus. The island had a lee where the dense pines broke the wind, and that pocket let me work near the water without showing a silhouette against the sky. Skylining is how you get spotted. I didn't use a rod. A shorthand line went out first, then a second, then a third. Each one set at a different depth with split-shot weights and a dark cork float that wouldn't shine in the sun. Hooks stayed small, size 10 or 12. Not because I wanted tiny fish, but because small hooks catch everything, and beggars can't be choosy. Checks happened fast and low. Knees in the mud, body behind a rock. The line came up hand over hand. The hook got cleared and the bait went back down. When a fish finally hit, usually a pale, sluggish trout, it felt cold and hard like a stone in my hands. The knife work happened right at the water line, and the guts were thrown deep and down current tossed where the undertow would carry the scent away from my landing. Cooking fish while hiding is tricky. In the old days, I would have pan-fried it in oil. Now frying was dangerous. Grease smoke smells delicious, and that smell travels for miles on the wind. The answer was poaching. I boiled the fish in a litter pot with just water and salt. It came out rubbery and gray, but the steam stayed trapped and the smell didn't leave the cabin. Mixed with a handful of rice, it turned into a meal that felt normal for about 10 minutes. Normal wasn't the same as easy. The mind hates a vacuum, and it keeps looking for noise when things get too quiet. Without phones, without traffic hum, without anyone to speak to, every small natural sound tries to become a warning signal. Wind hissing through pine needles, ice shifting against the basalt rock, a branch dropping somewhere in the dark. All of it pulled at my attention like a tap on the shoulder. The radio became a strange comfort. Most channels were static, but the weather band gave clean, unemotional facts, and sometimes a local AM station leaked through with a caller yelling about checkpoints or supplies. Those panicked voices proved other people were still out there making bad decisions and desperate deals. That reminder made the island feel less like a prison and more like a tactical position to hold. A notebook came out after dinner. The first page was just a logistics list. Wood, water, food, batteries, ammo. I didn't track every single bean, but I tracked the burn rate. If oats ran low too fast, I made a mark. If the coffee dipped below half, it got a mark. The point wasn't to obsess. The point was to avoid the shock of an empty box. I installed a small readiness rack near the door. Just a shelf with 2 cans of chili and 1 bag of rice that stayed visible. I called it the no panic shelf. If stress hit hard, glancing at that shelf reminded me I had a meal ready without digging through crates. It sounds minor, but it kept my hands from rummaging when my head got loud, and it kept the cabin orderly. Sleep stayed light and shallow. Some nights, the alarm cans on the door never moved, and the only thing that woke me was the stove cooling down and the metal contracting. Other nights, a distant engine would rise and fade, and my body would go rigid in the sleeping bag, listening for a second sound that never came. In those moments, the rifle felt heavy, but it also felt like a tool that solved only one kind of problem. The harder problems were the slow ones, fingers cracking and bleeding from the dry cold, small cuts that refused to heal, damp air that turned into a persistent cough, the boredom that pushes people to take stupid risks just to feel something change. Those threats don't sprint at you. They wait until you're tired and then they stack up. To fight the mental rot, days needed tasks with clear finish lines. Wood in the morning, water midday, perimeter check late afternoon, fishing when the light was gray and safe. A short set of push-ups and squats by the stove at night, just enough to keep legs strong and joints loose. Strong bodies make quieter movements, and quiet movements keep you unseen. One late afternoon movement flashed on the far shore. Through the viewing slit, using the binoculars, I watched a figure cross a private dock and stop to stare at the open water. The distance was too great to read a face, but the posture screamed worry. A second figure joined them, then a third, and they took turns pointing out across the lake, tracing lines with their fingers. They weren't pointing at me specifically. They were pointing at the emptiness. The sight made the cabin feel suddenly smaller. That night, the lantern stayed off completely and the stove stayed low. My breath looked white in the air, even indoors. One hand rested on the table near the bolt of the rifle, and the other held a cup that barely warmed my skin. The thought was simple and steady. The island would feed me, heat me, and hide me, but it would also test whether I could keep doing the same smart, boring things when the fear wanted me to do something loud. The first time another engine intruded on my water, it sounded wrong. Not loud, but careful, like someone trying to sneak a machine that wasn't built for stealth. The stove was dampened low, the cabin was dark, and early winter water acts like a sounding board, carrying noise for miles. I brought the binoculars up to the viewing slit, then moved silently to the porch, keeping my back pressed flat against the wall to scan the channel. A flat-bottom John boat slid out of the haze from the far shore, moving too straight for a fishing run, and too fast for sightseeing. For people sat low in the hull, shoulders hunched, heads swiveling back toward the land as if they expected something to chase them right into the lake. The motor sputtered once, caught, then settled into a thin, nervous hum. No running lights, no talking that I could hear over the wind. They weren't on my island yet, so the rifle stayed lowered, and I watched until the boat was close enough to read the story on their faces. Wet sleeves, mismatched gear, and the wide-eyed look of adrenaline crash told a clear story. They had run hard. Crucially, I saw a large red cooler in the center of the boat and 3 stuffed hiking packs jammed under the bench seats. They hadn't packed perfectly, but they had grabbed whatever was near the door, which meant they weren't coming empty-handed. When they drifted into voice range, I walked down to the landing, stayed on the high rock shelf where I had the advantage, and called out, "Cut the engine, and keep your hands where I can see them." The driver flinched, pulled the throttle down instantly, and let the boat glide on its momentum. A man in the back gripped and white-knuckled like he didn't trust the motor to start again. "Tell me why you're on the lake," I said, keeping my eyes on their hands in the dark shoreline behind them. The driver swallowed hard and answered because the woods behind us are full of them and the dock was the only clean line out. He glanced over his shoulder at the black water, then looked back at me and added, "We were in a rental cabin up the access road. We heard shouting, then glass breaking, then footsteps that didn't stop or slow down. When we saw the first one on the porch, we grabbed our bags and ran. And we didn't stop until we hit boats." The woman in the bow took a shaking breath and said, "We didn't come looking for you specifically, and we didn't even know this island had a cabin. We just needed water between us and whatever was on land." The words came out chattering and shaky, but the logic held up. On land, you get boxed in by geography. On water, you can keep a buffer zone. Names came next. "Who are you?" I asked. The driver answered Boone Sedgwick and nodded toward the others. Imagine apprentice Sloane Hargrove and Rafi Calder. Imagine spoke right after him fast and tight. "We drove up from the city thinking the cold and the trees would buy us time," she said. But the town by the launch was already breaking apart. "We heard gunshots last night and saw people fighting over fuel cans this morning." Sloane pointed at her soaked boots and said, "We can't sit in this aluminum boat and warm up, and we don't have enough gas to keep circling the lake all night. If you send us away, we'll try another dock, but we're already freezing." She looked me dead in the eye and added, "You can check us first. We know the drill." That line helped because a liar argues for trust, but a frightened person offers proof. "Any bites, scratches, or blood that isn't yours in the last 24 hours?" I asked. Rafi answered first, lifting his heavy sleeves to show wrists and forearms. "No bites, a few cuts from brush, but nothing from them." Boone nodded and said, "Same here," and Imagine added, "I scraped my shin on a rock when we pushed off." "That's it." Sloane met my gaze and said, "No bite, no scratch, and if any of us were hiding one, we wouldn't come into open water where there's nowhere to hide behind. We're clean." The boat drifted closer, the aluminum scraping lightly against the bottom, and I raised my hand. "Hold there," I said. "Don't touch the rock yet." They stopped the drift with the oar and sat still while the wind pushed small ripples past the bow. Another engine sound would have changed the equation entirely, so I listened hard for 5 seconds. Nothing, just water in the low creak of the hull. Letting 4 desperate people float around my island would be worse than bringing them in under control. If I turned them away, they might panic, beach on the other side of the island, and start a fire to stay warm, drawing every eye on the lake to my position. Bringing them in was risk management. "Here's how this works," I said, pointing at the shallow shelf beside the landing. "One at a time, you step into the shallows. You keep your hands visible. You bring your packs and that cooler up the rise with me. Packs stay closed until I say otherwise." Boone nodded once and said, "Understood." Then he used the oar to hold the bow off the rock. Imagine stepped out first, boots slipping on slick stone, and she caught herself with both hands held wide to show she wasn't reaching for a weapon. I kept my distance and said, "Stop at the bottom of the rise." She stopped. Sloane came next, then Rafi, then Boone, each one moving slow and deliberate, like they knew one wrong motion would end the only warm option within 10 miles. At the cabin, the heavy drop bar stayed set across the door until I was ready. The headlamp came on low. The first aid kit opened on the table. "Hands out," I said, and Boone told the others, "Do it." And they held out palms, wrists, and forearms while I checked for fresh breaks in the skin, fever, sweat, or the dark veins that signal infection. Jackets came off next, then collars were pulled down, then pant legs lifted to show calves. It was freezing, but nobody complained, and that disciplined silence mattered more than the shivering. When the medical checks were cleared, the hygiene corner came first. "Wash up," I said, tapping the jug and the soap. "Then sit by the stove and warm up slow. No eating until you're steady." Sloane nodded and moved straight to the water like she was grateful for a simple task. Imagine sank onto the bench, shaking violently now that the adrenaline was fading, and said, "I thought we were done out there." Rafi stared at the boarded window and added, "You built this place to stay invisible." Boone kept his eyes on the door bar while he warmed his hands, then asked, "What do you want from us?" He asked it like a transaction. "Work in honesty," I said. "You follow the rules, you help keep this place quiet, and you contribute those supplies to the common stock." Boone nodded once and answered, "We can do that." And for a moment, the cabin was just a warm room with wet clothes steaming by the fire. Outside, the lake went quiet again, but now there were 4 extra sets of boots by the stove and a boat tied at my rock, and it was clear the island's easy phase was over. With 4 new bodies in the cabin, the atmosphere shifted instantly from solitude to a tense, crowded hive. It wasn't just the extra carbon dioxide and the smell of wet wool drying near the stove. It was the math. Every mistake now had a multiplier attached to it. So, the next morning started with rigid protocols, not comfort. Boone woke before the sun and stood at the table like he was waiting for a shift briefing. He kept his voice low and asked, "What's the priority?" I pointed at the dwindling wood pile inside and the water jugs. "Heat and water," I said. "Those two stay ahead of the demand curve or we crash." Sloane rubbed her hands together, inspected the stove pipe, and added, "And we keep the smoke thin. If anyone is watching this lake with optics, a heavy column is just an arrow pointing right at us." Rafi didn't talk much, but he watched how the boat ropes sat against the rock, absorbing the mechanics of the camp. When I showed him the perimeter alarm, he nodded and said, "I can tighten this up, make it harder to step over." He took spare microcord and a few bells and reran the trip line so it hugged the brush, ensuring it would ring if someone tried to push through the gap rather than just walking the path. It wasn't fancy engineering, but it was cleaner. Imagine commandeered the sanitation zone like she was running a field hospital. She lifted the soap, checked the seal on the bucket lid, and said, "If this turns into a dirty campsite, dysentery will kill us faster than any raid." She laid out a non-negotiable routine on the spot. Hands washed before touching food, immediately after the toilet bucket, after handling raw fish, and before touching the freshwater spigot. Nobody argued. The cold makes people listen when the logic is sound. The cabin needed a second sleeping platform because 5 adults on one bunk was physical impossibility. Boone and I used the cordless drill and scrap lumber to build 2 low crude frames along the back wall just off the floor to break the cold bridge. Sloane cut plastic sheeting and stapled it behind the blankets on the drafty north wall, then tapped the wood and said, "Air leaks here. We seal this and the stove works half as hard to keep us alive." Food got sorted into a communal plan without speeches. I set the crates on the table and said, 2 meals, no grazing. Hunger is just part of the day now." Boone answered, "Fine," and marked the crate lid with pencil tallies. Rafi added, "If we pull fish, we eat fish and save the sealed cans for emergencies." And Imagine nodded like she'd been waiting for someone to say it out loud. Fishing changed with the extra manpower. 2 people could set and check the trot lines while one kept watch through the viewing slit and another processed wood, allowing the 5th to rest. That prevents the kind of stupid tired that leads to accidents. That afternoon, Boone and Rafi went down to the loose side, stayed low behind the granite shelf, and set 3 lines with dark cord. Rafi pointed at the far shore and said, "If a boat breaks that mist line, we cut the cords and vanish." Boone answered, "Agreed," and they kept their profiles below the rock. Sloane took custody of the power supply. She audited the battery pack, the folding solar panel, and the headlamps, then told me, "We charge only when the sky is bright and the wind is loud enough to cover movement, and we never leave the panel out long enough to catch a reflection." She also moved the charging station behind a hanging wool blanket so no tiny LED indicators could blink through the window gaps at night. The boat got a defensive upgrade, too. It stayed under the tarp, double-tied. The key stayed on a lanyard under my shirt. Rafi suggested a visual break, so he dragged a rotting waterlogged log into the shallows and tied some junk rope to it. From open water, it looked like trash that had washed up against the rocks, breaking the clean line of the landing. By evening, the cabin felt more like a system and less like a hiding spot. The stove ran steady. The water jugs were topped off. The toilet annex was secure. A small tray by the door held sanitizer and a rag, so the first touch inside was always clean. That night, Boone took the first watch, sitting at the table with the rifle resting on the padded blocks. He didn't pose with it. He just watched the slit. When I lay down on the new platform, the last thing I heard was him whispering to Sloane, "If you hear a motor, you wake me first." And her answering, "If I hear a motor, you'll be awake already." It was a dry line, but it meant we were on the same page. We were still hidden, but now we had to earn it every single hour. The first confirmation that the lake had its own predatory ecosystem came 3 days after Boone and the others arrived. It started with a thin, dirty trail of wood smoke rising from the near shore at dawn, followed by the sound of a small outboard motor running low and slow. From the viewing slit, the boat looked familiar. A flat-bottomed aluminum john boat painted a dull, oxidized green. The kind locals used for checking trot lines or duck hunting in the marshy inlets. The motor sounded ancient, a rhythmic chug, but it was tuned and healthy. A man at the tiller wore a heavy Carhartt cap and moved with the lazy confidence of someone who knew every submerged rock in the county. Two teenagers sat forward, heads on swivels, scanning the shoreline docks like they were shopping. Boone leaned in behind my shoulder, breath steaming, in the cold room, and asked if I knew the guy. I told him I didn't know the name, but he wasn't lost. Sloane kept the binoculars glued to the slit and noted, "He's checking boat draft and fuel tanks, not fishing spots." The skiff vanished behind a rocky point, then reappeared closer to our channel, and I waited until the sound faded completely before stepping outside to check the perimeter. The rule remained absolute. No silhouettes, no sudden movements, and no patterns. One clean look at the island could turn into a floor plan for a raid. By late afternoon, the same motor returned, but this time, the pitch was different, deeper, more direct, pointed straight toward our open water. The skiff wasn't alone. A second boat followed in its wake. A heavy fiberglass utility hull riding low in the water, packed with bodies huddled under moving blankets. I could see long shapes laid across knees, shotguns, and hunting rifles, tools meant for ending arguments before they started. Rafi heard the engines first and moved toward the door with a tense energy. When he saw me reaching for the bolt action, he shook his head once and whispered, "Let them talk from the water. If we show weapons now, we escalate before we know the demand." I nodded. The lead John boat cut its engine about 100 yards off our landing, rocking gently in the chop. The man in the cap stood up, balancing easily on the shifting deck, and called out, "Cabin on the island. We see you now." He waited a beat, letting the silence hang, then added, "We're the Hale family. This is our water." I stayed well back from the window board, speaking through the narrow slit, so my voice carried without offering a target. "Keep your boats where they are," I shouted. "You don't know who you're talking to." He laughed once, a dry, dismissive bark, and pointed a gloved finger toward the cabin roof. "I've watched you come and go for years," he called back. The quiet guy with the old aluminum boat and the weekender attitude. Now the world's gone sideways and quiet spots don't belong to one man anymore. The second boat drifted a little closer, flanking slightly, and I counted at least 5 people in it. One adult held binoculars, scanning our windows, while another kept a hand near a pump-action shotgun. Boone stood just behind my right shoulder out of the line of fire and asked what they wanted. "Food, fuel, and leverage," I whispered. The man up front changed his tone, dropping it lower and steadier, trying on a neighborly mask that didn't quite fit. "We're not here to fight," he lied. He nodded back toward the mainland shore. "We've got kids and elders on land. Winter is hitting hard. You've got a stove, a roof, and a boat that runs." Through the scope, I could see past them to the shore. A makeshift camp on the bank, pallets stacked for windbreaks, and a smoky barrel fire. They were desperate, which made them capable of anything. Sloane leaned close to the wall and whispered, "He's selling his need, but he brought a boarding party." Imagine stood near the stove, hands clenched white, and said, "If they're already claiming the lake, they won't stop at asking." I kept my voice flat and projected it across the water. "Talking happens on your side of the lake. This island isn't a public dock." The man's jaw tightened, visible even at this distance. He didn't leave. "Then trade," he yelled. "Fuel for food, ammo for blankets. You don't have to starve alone out here." It was a trap. If I answered with numbers, he learned our limits. If I met him on open water, he learned our faces and our gear. So, I gave him nothing. "Not interested," I shouted. "Turn around." He didn't turn. He pointed aggressively toward our landing. "You don't get it," he called, anger breaking through the neighbor act. "We're local. We know every cabin, every cache, every hidden key. People who aren't local don't get to plant a flag and act like kings. You want to stay here, you pay into the lake." In the second boat, One of the older boys raised a smartphone like he was recording the encounter. A reflex from the old world, then lowered it when he remembered there was no signal to upload it to. Rafi murmured, "They're counting us, trying to see how many guns answer back." Boone answered under his breath, "Let them count the boards instead." I told them, "This is your only warning. Don't come closer." The man stared at the trees for a long time, searching for movement, trying to spot a muzzle flash or a face. After a long second, he nodded once, not in agreement, but marking the moment. "Fine," he shouted. "We'll be back when you're ready to be reasonable." Both boats turned away in a wide, slow arc, deliberate and insulting. They weren't fleeing. They were leaving on their own terms. The engines faded and the lake went quiet again. But it was the heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a knock on the door when the visitor walks away smiling because they've already chosen their next move. That night, Boone sat watched for a double shift while he kept the rifle steady on the padded rest. He said, "They knew you were here before, which means they know the island isn't empty now." Sloan checked the window blackout screws and answered, "They brought the whole crew for a first visit. That's a probe. They'll be back to break the shell." Outside, the ice formed a thicker, jagged rim along the rocks, and the reality was ugly and simple. Open water might keep the dead things out, but it doesn't stop hungry families from testing the lock. The raid broke on a night when the wind died completely and the lake went dangerously smooth. We had kept the stove dampened low and the lantern cold, but the Hales didn't need light to find us anymore. They only needed the obsession with a warm roof. Boone had the first watch. Sloan lay half-dressed on her sleeping platform with her boots still laced. Rafi sat at the table coiling spare paracord just listening. Imagine stood near the stove, her eyes locked on the drop bar across the door. Nobody spoke until a thin, high-pitched engine whine rose from the north bank. Then a second motor answered it in harmony. Boone leaned into the viewing slit and whispered on two hulls, and I slid in behind him to verify. Dark shapes riding low in the water, cutting a straight wake toward our landing. No pretense of fishing this time. The plan for that moment was binary. Nobody opened the door. Nobody stepped onto the porch to negotiate. If they wanted the island, they had to expose themselves on open water, and we had to stop the boats before boots touched our rock. The lead skiff cut its throttle at about 60 yards. A voice carried across the stillness, calm and practiced, expecting obedience. "Walter," the man called out, "we're here to collect what you owe the lake." He paused, leaving space for me to beg, then added, "Bring out the fuel in the food cases, and nobody gets hurt." Sloan leaned close to the wall and whispered that the ice rim was thicker tonight, a jagged obstacle. Rafi nodded toward the tarp line and murmured that they were coming for the outboard and the gas cans first. They needed mobility more than food. Boone kept the rifle stock tight against his shoulder and asked if we should warn them again. "We already did," I said. My voice went out through the slit, flat and final. "Turn around," I shouted. "If you keep coming, you're going to swim." The lead skiff didn't turn. The second boat drifted wider, flanking right, trying to angle for the side of the landing where the rock shelf dipped low. The man in the lead boat laughed, a sharp cracking sound, and called back, "You won't shoot. You're alone on a rock and we have the numbers." He was betting his life that fear would do his work for him. Boone exhaled slowly and said, "Take the metal," and I nodded. The rifle was already settled on the padded rest. The crosshairs settled on the lead motor's cowling, not the man, because a dead engine ends a raid faster than a body count. The shot cracked, a deafening report in the small room, and rolled over the water like thunder. The skip's transom rang with the impact. Sparks showered and the motor jerked violently before sputtering into a rough, choking idle. They shouted at each other in panic. The boat yawed, losing steerage. In the second skiff, someone raised a deer rifle and fired blindly at the cabin. The round hit our outer pine boards with a heavy thud and threw with splinters across the floor. Nobody flinched. That's exactly what the extra lumber was for. Rafi whispered, "They're going to rush it. and the second boat gunned its throttle, trying to close the distance before we could take their engine, too. Sloane slid the pump shotgun into her shoulder and waited, steady, not eager. Boone fired next, aiming low on the second motor. The round sparked off the mount. The engine choked, then died completely, and the skiff lost its line. It drifted helplessly toward the rock shelf, silent, except for frantic voices and the slap of water against aluminum. That should have ended the fight, but the man in the lead boat stood up, furious now, adrenaline overriding survival instinct. "You just bought yourself a war," he screamed. He grabbed an oar and started paddling, dragging the disabled skiff closer by sheer force of will. Two others leaned forward with push-poles. The first pole tip scraped against our stone. The sound was small, but it meant they had crossed the line. The lead man stepped out into the freezing shallows with a shotgun held high, boots splashing. He wasn't thinking about the dead on the shore. He was thinking about taking a warm room by force. The door stayed barred. I called out one last chance. "Back to your boat." He shouted, "Open up!" as if volume made it a command. He waded forward, raising the shotgun toward the cabin wall. My shot went into him center mass, one clean hit with a hunting round. He dropped hard into the water, the gun slipping from his hands, and didn't try to stand up again. The people behind him froze, their bodies needing a second to catch up with what their eyes had just seen. For a breath, nobody moved. Then the second boat's crew started screaming his name. One teen jumped down to grab him, and Boone barked, "Don't come closer," and the kids stopped, shaking violently. Rafi stepped to the slit and said, "Get him and leave now." Sloane added, "If you touch this rock again, you won't leave at all." The family hesitated. Then two of them dragged the fallen man back toward the skiff, slipping on the wet, icy stone. They hauled him over the gunwale, dead weight, heavy and limp, and the boat dipped dangerously low. Someone yanked the starter cord until the flooded motor coughed smoke. Another grabbed an oar and pulled clumsy and fast. The second skiff did the same. Both boats retreated without dignity, roars biting the water in a chaotic rhythm. But the gunfire and shouting had traveled, and the far shore answered. A wet, broken call rose from the trees. Then shapes moved between the trunks and spilled toward the mudbank. The Hales saw it and rowed harder, but boats without motors crossed water slowly. The dead reached the shoreline and stepped into the shallows, stopping only when the water hit their knees, swaying and reaching with pale arms. They didn't swim. They didn't need to. The living were coming to them. Both skiffs scraped onto the mudbank in a panic and bodies spilled out, half carrying the body of their leader, half running for the trees. The dead turned toward the noise and followed, piling in behind them like a rising tide. We stayed still and silent in the cabin until the last shout faded into the woods. Then Boone eased back from the rifle and said, "They won't be back tonight." Imagine exhaled like she had been holding her breath for 10 minutes and whispered, "He forced it." Sloane stared at the dark water through the slit and answered, "He chose it." Nobody celebrated. The cabin just stayed warm, and the island stayed quiet. And somewhere on the far shore, a big family learned the hard way that this rock was not an easy place to take. Real winter settled in heavy after the raid. The lake kept a jagged rim of ice along the rocks, but the open channel stayed dark and moving, acting as a moat the dead couldn't cross. We checked that ice every morning, praying it wouldn't thicken enough to bridge the gap, because if the lake froze solid, the siege would truly begin. For now, the water held. Nobody treated the shooting like a victory lap. It wasn't a win. It was a line we hadn't wanted to cross. And it was proof that the island only stayed ours if we held it quietly, consistently, and without blinking. Boone kept watch with the rifle on the rest, not because he liked the weight of it, but because sleep had to stay possible for the rest of us. Sloane managed the stove like an engineer, keeping the burn clean and the smoke thin, and she rode everyone constantly to dry their socks and gloves before moisture became frostbite. Rafi kept tightening the nuts and bolts that prevent catastrophic failure, checking rope knots, adjusting the trip alarms, and brushing snow off the boat tarp. Fishing stayed steady but grim. Some days we pulled nothing and ate plain rice and beans. Other days we landed enough trout to make the cabin smell like a kitchen for an hour, and then the lids went back on tight. The damper went half closed and the smell was purged. Cleaning happened strictly at the water line. Hands got sanitized at Imagine Station and scraps went deep so nothing lingered near our landing. Our rules stayed simple because simple rules survive stress. No lights after dark unless the shutters were battened down. No loud tools unless the wind howled loud enough to cover the sound. No trips to shore unless the vote was unanimous. When the walls started closing in, when someone felt tired, cold, or irrationally angry, they said it out loud before it turned into a mistake. Boone did it first one night, staring at the viewing slit and saying, "I'm getting jumpy. If I snap at anyone, tell me to breathe." Sloane nodded once from her bunk and answered, "Same here. We're good." And the tension in the room eased just enough to let us rest. On clear mornings, the far shore looked emptier than it had at the start. Sometimes we saw movement near the hail camp. Smaller groups now moving with extreme caution, staying tight to their fire barrel. They never brought a boat onto open water again. That didn't mean forgiveness. It meant they learned the price of admission and they decided it wasn't worth paying twice. The cabin is still small. The boarded windows are still ugly. The drop bar is still heavy. None of that matters. What matters is heat, clean water, and a safe place to close your eyes. A spare gas can stays buried for the worst case scenario, and the boat key stays on a cord under my shirt against my skin. If the spring thaw comes and the world has pockets of order again, we'll decide then whether to move. If it doesn't, we'll keep doing the same quiet, boring work that got us through the first weeks. Would water, fish, and watch. My name is Walter Kane. 5 years ago, this place was where I came to fish and be alone. Now, it's where we stay alive by staying boring, staying careful, and staying hidden. If you enjoyed the story, please hit the like button, subscribe, and comment down below where you're listening from. See you in the next